You think you're weak. You were never taught to handle your emotions. You're not weak. You're untrained. You tried to hold it together. Maybe it was a conversation that went sideways. Maybe it was a moment of silence that said everything. Maybe it was just a Tuesday afternoon and something small, something that shouldn't have mattered, pulled you completely off balance. And in that moment, you didn't recognize yourself. You reacted. And the second it was over, the weight came down. Not just regret, something heavier. That quiet, familiar voice that shows up after. The one that doesn't yell, it just whispers. Why can't you control yourself? What is wrong with you? You know better than this. And here's what makes it worse. You do know better. You've read things. You've listened. You've told yourself 100 times that next time would be different. But when the moment came, the reaction was already happening before the thought even arrived. So you filed it under the same category you always do, weakness. But what if that word is the problem? Think about this for a moment. If someone grew up in a place with no water nearby, no lake, no pool, no river, and you handed them a set of swim fins at 30 years old and pushed them into the deep end, what would happen? They would struggle. They would panic. They might not make it to the surface on their own. Would you call that person weak? Of course not. You would call them untrained. The failure had nothing to do with their character, their intelligence, or their inner strength. It had everything to do with the fact that nobody ever taught them how to move through water. Now ask yourself, honestly, when did anyone ever sit down with you and teach you how to move through emotion? Not how to perform composure, not how to appear calm, not how to smile through the storm so that others feel comfortable, but actually how to feel something difficult, understand what it is and respond to it with clarity instead of chaos. For most people, the answer is never. What we received instead was a set of unspoken rules. Rules like, don't cry in front of others, don't show that you're afraid, don't be too much, don't fall apart, keep it moving, stay strong. These weren't lessons in emotional mastery. They were instructions in emotional concealment. And we followed them, not because we chose to, but because we were young, and nobody had a map for anything deeper than that. So you grew up. You became capable, responsible, functional. And somewhere beneath all of that, an entire dimension of your inner world stayed undeveloped. Not broken, not damaged beyond repair, just untrained. And untrained things don't stay quiet forever. They show up at the worst moments, in the middle of an argument where you suddenly can't find words, in the silence of a room where you realize you don't know what you actually feel, in the pattern you keep repeating, the one you can see clearly in retrospect but can never seem to interrupt in the moment. That's not weakness. That's the natural result of a skill that was never built. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was born into slavery and became one of the most influential minds in ancient history, wrote in his discourses that the untrained person is one who blames others for their own troubles. The person beginning their training is one who blames themselves, but the truly educated person blames neither. He was describing a progression, a movement, a training that takes place over time, through awareness, through discomfort, through the willingness to look inward without flinching. He called it training, because that's what it is. Not a personality transplant, not a radical transformation. A training, gradual, cumulative, real. That moment when you react and immediately regret it, that's not evidence of a broken character. It's evidence of a gap between what you feel and what you know how to do with what you feel. And gaps can be closed. The problem was never you. The problem was that no one ever handed you the tools. The first lie you were taught about emotions. There's a moment most people can trace back, if they're willing to look. Not a dramatic moment necessarily. More often it's something quieter, a child crying and being told to stop, a teenager feeling overwhelmed and being told to toughen up, someone expressing fear and being met with impatience instead of understanding. Small moments, repeated over years. And from those moments a belief was constructed, not consciously chosen but absorbed, the belief that emotions are problems to be solved, weaknesses to be hidden, or storms to be waited out. Nobody announced this belief out loud. The lesson came through what was modeled, what was rewarded, and what was quietly punished. If you showed emotion and the room got uncomfortable, You learned that emotion makes others uncomfortable. If you cried and were told you were being dramatic, you learned that your inner experience was excessive. If you were angry and immediately shut down, you learned that anger has no legitimate place. And so you adapted. You shaped yourself around the unspoken rules of your environment, and you called it growing up. But here is what actually happened. You didn't learn to handle your emotions. You learned to hide them from others first, and eventually from yourself. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Hiding an emotion doesn't resolve it. It relocates it. It moves from the visible surface of your behavior into the deeper architecture of how you operate, how you make decisions, how you respond under pressure, how you talk to yourself at 2 in the morning when no one is watching. The suppression became so habitual that it started to feel like control. And that's the lie. Not an intentional deception, but a misunderstanding passed from one generation to the next, quietly, like a language nobody chose to learn, but everyone ended up speaking. The Stoics understood this with unusual precision. Epictetus drew a clear line between what belongs to us and what does not. Our judgments, our intentions, our chosen responses, these belong to us. The emotions themselves, in their first arising, do not. They are not commands. They are not verdicts. They are signals. But if you were never taught that emotions are signals, if you were taught instead that they are threats, then of course you would spend your life either suppressing them or being ambushed by them. No one showed you how to simply receive what you feel, understand what it's pointing to, and then choose how to respond. You weren't taught that feelings carry information. You were taught that feelings cause problems, and you've been operating from that assumption ever since. The invisible pattern running your life. You've noticed it before, you know you have. That specific situation, maybe it's conflict, maybe it's criticism, maybe it's silence from someone you care about, and the reaction that follows. Not the reaction you would choose if you had a second to think. The one that arrives before thinking does. The tension in the chest, the shutdown, the sharpness in the voice that you didn't plan. The withdrawal that happens automatically, like a door closing on its own. And afterward, once the moment has passed, you can see it clearly. You can trace exactly what happened, understand what you could have done differently. The clarity is almost frustrating in its precision, because you didn't lack understanding. You lacked access to that understanding when it actually mattered. And you've told yourself more than once, next time will be different. But next time comes, and it isn't. This is not a failure of willpower. What you are experiencing is the nature of a pattern, a deeply established, emotionally reinforced, neurologically grooved pattern that operates faster than conscious thought. Carl Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. He was describing a mechanism. When experiences, especially emotionally charged ones, are not processed or integrated, they don't disappear. They sink below the level of conscious awareness and continue operating from there. They shape your interpretations. They color your perceptions. They determine what you notice and what you ignore, who feels safe and who feels threatening. So when you find yourself reacting the same way for the 10th time, the same defensiveness, the same retreat, the same explosion followed by the same regret, it is not because you are weak. It is because the pattern was formed at a level deeper than willpower can reach. You are not reacting to the present moment as it actually is. You are reacting to what the present moment reminds you of. And that distinction between what is actually happening and what your nervous system believes is happening is where most of the suffering lives. The Stoics called this the judgment we place on events. Epictetus was clear. It is not the event itself that disturbs us, but the opinion we hold about the event. And most of those opinions were formed in the past, carried forward unconsciously, and applied automatically to situations that may have nothing to do with their original source. This is what makes emotional patterns so disorienting. On the surface, life looks like a series of choices, but underneath, many of those choices were made long before the moment arrived, made by a younger version of you, in circumstances that required a certain kind of adaptation, and then locked in as the default response to anything that carries a similar emotional signature. You are not reacting to the present moment as it actually is. You are reacting to what the present moment reminds you of. And that distinction, between what is actually happening and what your nervous system believes is happening, is where most of the suffering lives. The Stoics called this the judgment we place on events. Epictetus was clear. It is not the event itself that disturbs us, but the opinion we hold about the event, and most of those opinions were formed in the past, carried forward unconsciously, and applied automatically to situations that may have nothing to do with their original source. The invisible pattern is not a character flaw, it is a structure. And structures, unlike character, can be examined, they can be understood, they can, over time, be changed. But first, they have to be seen. You don't feel what you think you feel. There's a specific kind of conversation that ends badly. Not because the people involved don't care about each other, but because one person is responding to something the other person cannot see. Someone says something small. A comment, a tone, a pause that lasted a second too long. And the reaction that follows is disproportionate. Too sharp, too withdrawn, too heavy for the moment. The other person is confused, and the person reacting is frustrated, because from the inside, the reaction feels completely justified. What's happening is not irrational, but it is layered. The emotion on the surface, the anger, the defensiveness, the sudden coldness, is rarely the emotion at the root. It is the one that arrived fastest. But beneath it, if you are willing and able to go deeper, there is usually something older and quieter. Anger very often covers fear, not the fear of immediate danger, but the fear of being dismissed, of being unseen, of not mattering. The anger is real, it is genuinely felt, but it is functioning as a protective layer over something more vulnerable underneath. Anxiety, in many cases, is not really about the thing it appears to be about. The worry, the obsessive planning, the inability to relax. These often point not to a logical concern about the future, but to an underlying experience of having no control. The anxiety is the surface, the helplessness is the root. Think of it like a fire alarm. When an alarm goes off in a building, people respond to the sound. They move toward the exits, and the alarm is doing exactly what it was designed to do, alerting you that something requires attention. But the alarm is not the fire. And responding only to the alarm, silencing it, ignoring it, learning to sleep through it, does nothing about what caused it to go off. Your emotional reactions are alarms. They are the sound your inner system makes when something requires attention. And for most people, the entire relationship with emotion is a relationship with the alarm, trying to silence it or being overwhelmed by it. But the fire, the actual source, remains untouched. This is what makes emotional work so difficult without the right frame. You can spend years addressing symptoms. You can work on your anger management while the fear underneath goes completely unexamined. You can treat your anxiety with every tool available while the core experience of powerlessness stays exactly where it is, hidden beneath the alarm, waiting for the next trigger. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. The word estimate is important. He was pointing to the interpretation, the layer of meaning that sits between the event and the response. But to reach that layer, you first have to get past the alarm. You have to be willing to ask not just, what am I feeling, but what is this feeling actually pointing to? That question alone changes everything, because when you stop fighting the anger and start getting curious about the fear underneath it, the emotional experience shifts, not because the feeling disappears, but because you are finally in contact with the real thing. And real things can be worked with. The alarm was never the problem. It was just the only part of the signal you were trained to hear. And once you understand that, once you stop relating to your emotions as enemies to be defeated and start relating to them as signals to be decoded, something fundamental shifts. Not in the frequency of the emotion, but in your relationship to it. The anger still arrives, the anxiety still appears, but you are no longer at war with the messenger. You are finally, for the first time, curious about the message. The moment control slips, and how to get it back. Most people believe they know when they lose control. They picture a moment of eruption, a raised voice, a slammed door, a statement said in anger that cannot be taken back. And because they are watching for that moment, They believe they will see it coming. But that's not where control is lost. Control is lost much earlier than that. It happens in the fraction of a second between the stimulus and the first internal response, in the instant when the nervous system registers something and assigns it a meaning. That assignment happens automatically. And by the time you are aware of what you are feeling, the process is already well underway. Epictetus wrote that some things are in our power and others are not. The first movement of an emotion, that initial arising, that first wave, is not in your power. It is the body's automatic, biological response to experience. You cannot stop the first reaction from occurring any more than you can stop your eyes from adjusting to sudden light. But the judgment that follows, the meaning you assign, the interpretation you layer on top of that first movement, that is yours, that belongs to you. And that is exactly where the real work begins. The problem is that most people never reach the judgment. They go directly from stimulus to response without passing through any conscious process at all, not because they are incapable, but because the gap between stimulus and response has never been developed. It was never trained. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, wrote privately, in notes never intended for public view, about the daily effort required to govern his own inner responses before governing an empire. He would prepare himself each morning, reminding himself of what he might encounter and how he intended to respond. He was not trying to suppress emotion. He was training the gap. And that is the insight that changes the entire frame. Control is not something you exercise in the heat of the moment through sheer force of will. Control is something you build, incrementally, deliberately, in the quiet moments before the heat arrives. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, described it this way: between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. The space is real. The question is whether you have ever been inside it. For most people, the sequence from stimulus to response feels seamless, as though the reaction was the only possible outcome. But that seamlessness is not inevitable. It is the result of repetition, of a pattern so deeply grooved that the step between trigger and response has effectively disappeared, not because it cannot exist, but because it was never reinforced. The brain does what it has been trained to do. Pathways that are used frequently become faster, more automatic, more dominant. Pathways that are rarely used remain underdeveloped and difficult to access, especially under pressure. If you have spent years moving from trigger to reaction without pause, and most people have, then the pathway of automatic response is extremely well developed. It is fast, efficient, and deeply familiar. It feels like instinct. It feels like personality. It feels like who you are. And the pathway of deliberate pause, of observation, of choosing, is narrow and slow and easily overwhelmed when the emotional intensity rises. This is why intellectual understanding is not enough. You can understand completely that you should pause before reacting. You can believe it. You can repeat it to yourself. And the next time the trigger arrives, the automatic pathway will still activate faster than the deliberate one, because understanding alone does not build the neural infrastructure that pause requires. The mind was never trained to pause. That is the accurate diagnosis. But untrained does not mean untrainable. The dangerous myth of staying strong, and what Stoicism actually teaches. At some point, someone taught you what strength was supposed to look like. The message arrived, and it was consistent. Strength means not being moved. Strength means keeping it together. Strength means that what happens on the outside does not visibly affect what happens on the inside. And for a long time, that definition probably served you. It helped you function. It helped you show up. But there is a cost to that definition that rarely gets examined. The version of strength that equates to suppression does not actually produce strength. It produces a particular kind of exhaustion, a deepening disconnection from your own inner experience, and over time a reduced capacity to understand what you are actually feeling, because the habit of suppression becomes so automatic that it operates even when you are alone. You stop feeling, not because you have transcended emotion, but because you have become skilled at cutting off access to it. And here is the contradiction that makes this myth genuinely dangerous. The more successfully you suppress, the more you believe it is working. The absence of visible disturbance looks like mastery, but what is actually happening is that the emotional content is not being processed. It is being stored, pressurized, and pressure, held long enough, finds a way out. Sometimes through the body, sometimes through sudden disproportionate reactions to small events, sometimes through a slow withdrawal from life, a flattening of experience, a reduced capacity for genuine presence. The myth of staying strong does not protect you from your emotions. It simply changes the form in which they eventually arrive. This is where most people's understanding of Stoicism goes completely wrong. When most people hear the word Stoic, a specific image forms: the person who doesn't react, cold, detached, unreachable by the ordinary turbulence of emotional life. That image is not Stoicism, it is a misreading of it. The Stoics were not emotionless. Marcus Aurelius lost children. He grieved. He struggled with anger, with frustration, with the weight of governing an empire in the middle of plague and war. His meditations, written entirely for himself, never intended as a public document, are full of the texture of a man in genuine emotional contact with his life. What they reveal is not someone who has escaped feeling, but someone who has developed a disciplined relationship with feeling. Epictetus described what he called the first movements, the automatic, involuntary responses that the body and mind produce in reaction to experience. A sudden, loud noise makes you startle. An unexpected loss produces grief. These first movements are not within our control, and the Stoics never claimed otherwise. What is within our control is what happens next. The assent, the internal agreement you give to the story, the emotion is telling, the judgment you layer on top of the initial response. That is where human freedom lives. Stoicism is not a wall, it is a practice of deliberate interpretation. Suppression says, do not feel this. The Stoic practice says, feel it, examine it, and then choose your relationship to it. One cuts off the signal, the other receives the signal and works with it deliberately. Real strength, not the performance of it, but the actual internal capacity, requires access to your emotional experience. It requires the ability to feel something difficult without being immediately controlled by it. And that ability cannot be developed if the first response to any uncomfortable feeling is to shut it down. You cannot master what you cannot see. The myth of staying strong has been keeping you fragile in ways you may not have recognized, because the fragility is interior, invisible and disguised as discipline, the skill you were never given, and why you keep going back. There is a specific ability that sits at the center of everything discussed so far. It is not a technique. It is something more fundamental, the capacity to observe your own inner experience without immediately becoming it, to feel anger without being anger, to notice anxiety without being consumed by it, to recognize the familiar pull of an old pattern and remain present with it long enough to choose rather than simply react. Most people have experienced this accidentally. There are moments, rare, usually unpredictable, when something that would normally trigger an automatic response instead produces a strange clarity. You see the pattern forming. You notice the emotion arriving. You are, for a few seconds, the observer of your own inner process rather than simply a participant in it. And in those moments, something different becomes possible. Not perfect response, not the absence of emotion, but genuine choice. Not selected from the usual menu of automatic reactions, but arising from a more deliberate place. The problem is that these moments are inconsistent. They cannot be summoned on demand. And when the emotional intensity is highest, when the stakes are real, they are least available. This is because the capacity to observe without immediately reacting is exactly that. A capacity. Something that exists on a spectrum, that strengthens through practice and weakens through disuse. It is not a switch that can be flipped. It is more like a physical ability, present in rudimentary form in almost everyone, but requiring consistent development to become reliable under pressure. Epictetus described this development with a directness that still carries weight centuries later. He wrote that you become what you repeatedly do. That character is not declared. It is constructed through practice, through daily attention, through the willingness to return to the same effort even after failing at it many times. The pause is not a technique you apply in a crisis. It is a capacity you build in ordinary moments, in the small frustrations of a regular day, where the cost of failure is minimal and the opportunity to practice is constant. Every moment where you notice what you are feeling before acting on it, even imperfectly, even a second too late, is a moment where that pathway is being reinforced. Slowly, cumulatively, in a way that does not feel significant in the moment, but becomes significant over time. This is why the development of this capacity happens in the quiet moments, not the crisis ones. It is built through small acts of attention repeated over time, through the daily ordinary practice of noticing what is actually happening inside you before deciding what to do about it. But even with this understanding, even with genuine intention to develop this capacity, there is one more obstacle that doesn't get named often enough, because the pattern you keep repeating isn't just a habit, it has become identity. When a pattern has been repeated enough times, especially when it began in childhood, especially when it became the primary way of navigating emotional difficulty, it stops being experienced as behavior and starts being experienced as character. It no longer feels like something you do. It feels like something you are. And this is where change becomes genuinely difficult in a way that no amount of intellectual understanding can resolve. Because when you try to change a behavior that is connected to identity, the resistance you encounter is not laziness. It is the mind protecting what it understands itself to be. Every time you move toward a different response, something inside generates friction, a pullback toward the familiar, a quiet suggestion that the new response is somehow not really you. Carl Jung described this as the tension between the persona, the identity constructed for functioning in the world, and the deeper self that exists beneath it. We invest so much in the persona that we defend it even when it is causing us harm. Part of you knows the reactive pattern is not who you want to be, but it still feels like who you are. And that feeling, not the understanding, not the intention, is what governs behavior when the pressure arrives. The path forward is the gradual, honest process of separating your identity from the behavior, recognizing that the reaction you keep having is something you learned, not something you are, that it was adopted in a specific context for specific reasons, and that its persistence does not make it permanent. You are not the reaction. You are the one who can see it, and that distance, however thin, however inconsistent at first, is the beginning of a different relationship with yourself. You were never broken. Now you can't unsee it. Somewhere along the way you started to believe that the difficulty was evidence of a defect. Not in those words, perhaps. It comes in quieter forms, the persistent sense that other people seem to handle things better than you do, the exhaustion of feeling like you are always working harder than you should have to maintain basic internal stability. The moments of honest self-examination that tip, almost inevitably, into self-indictment. The word broken may never have been used, but the feeling it describes, something fundamentally wrong at the core, something that needs to be fixed before real life can properly begin, that feeling is not uncommon, and it is the most damaging consequence of everything this video has examined. Because if you believe you are broken, you approach your inner life as a repair project. You look for what is wrong. You try to eliminate it. You measure progress by how much less wrong you seem to be. And the entire orientation keeps you in a relationship with yourself that is fundamentally adversarial. You against you, constantly, exhaustingly. But what if the prosecution is based on a false premise? What if the difficulty, the reactivity, the patterns, the emotional responses that have felt out of control, none of that was evidence of a broken interior? What if it was simply the natural consequence of navigating a complex inner world without the tools, the language, the models, or the guidance that the navigation requires? A person who has been trying to read a map in a language they were never taught has not failed at navigation. They have been working without adequate resources. The destination is not beyond them. The capacity is not absent. What was missing was the preparation. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." The emphasis is not on analyzing where things went wrong. It is on the present orientation, on what is chosen now with whatever clarity is currently available. The Stoic frame does not offer comfort in the form of excusing the past. It offers something more valuable: the understanding that the past is not the determining factor of what is possible now, that the patterns formed in conditions of limited awareness do not have permanent authority over the person who is, in this moment, developing greater awareness. You were not broken, you were misguided by the absence of instruction, by the models available to you, by a culture that treats emotional depth as a liability and emotional suppression as a virtue. And misguided is not a permanent condition, it is a starting point. The guilt that has accumulated about the reactions, the patterns, the moments that did not go the way you would have chosen, that guilt can remain if you insist on the broken narrative, or it can transform into something more useful: responsibility. Not the punitive kind, not the kind that demands you continually account for past failures, but the forward-facing kind. The understanding that now, with greater clarity, a different orientation is possible. Not because you have finally fixed what was wrong, but because you are beginning to see that what you thought was wrong was never the truth about you. This is what is happening now, as a result of something accumulating. A willingness, developed over time, to look honestly at the interior, to ask the questions that are genuinely uncomfortable, to resist the pull towards simple explanations and remain present with the complexity of what is actually happening inside. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea throughout his meditations: the ruling faculty, the part of the mind capable of governing itself. Not the part that reacts, not the part that produces emotion, but the part that can observe all of those processes and choose its relationship to them. Most people spend their entire lives believing that the reactive part is all there is, that the voice that judges, the emotion that floods, the pattern that repeats, that this is the totality of the inner experience, and from inside that belief, change seems nearly impossible. But the shift reveals something different. It reveals that there is a part of you that is not the reaction, a part that can watch the anger arrive without being anger, a part that can feel the pull of the old pattern without being compelled to follow it, a part that can hold the emotion, examine it, and remain present with it without either suppressing it or being swept away by it. This is not a philosophical abstraction, it is an experience, specific, recognizable, and available to anyone who has done enough of the inner work described here. The practical experience of this shift is subtle but unmistakable once you have felt it. It is the moment in an argument where you notice that you are getting defensive, and the noticing itself creates a breath of space. Not enough to completely change what follows, perhaps, but enough to introduce a question where before there was only reaction. It is the moment where anxiety arrives, and instead of immediately trying to resolve it or suppress it, you find yourself able to sit with it for a moment, to observe its texture, to ask what it is actually responding to, without the usual urgency to make it stop. It is the moment where the familiar judgment about yourself arrives, and you notice it arriving. And in the noticing, you realize that you are not that voice. You are the one who can hear it. Something that, once seen, genuinely cannot be unseen. The change that is possible from here is not instantaneous. It will not be linear. There will be days that feel like complete regression, days when the old patterns run at full speed and the observer seems entirely absent. Those days are not failures, they are part of the terrain. Epictetus wrote that progress is made not by the one who can speak brilliantly about the faculty of choice, but by the one who actually practices choosing, who returns to the practice after failing, who does not require conditions to be perfect before the work begins. A direction, not a destination. You are not trying to arrive at a version of yourself that never struggles. You are developing a relationship with your inner world that is honest enough, patient enough, and clear enough that struggle no longer requires the additional weight of shame. That emotion no longer carries the verdict of weakness. That the next difficult moment is met not with the question of what is wrong with you, but with the question of what is actually happening and what, from this clearer place, you might choose to do with it. That is the difference between a life spent reacting and a life spent, however imperfectly, however gradually, actually lived. The next time the emotion comes, and it will come, you will not be the same person who was ambushed by it before. Not because you have become invulnerable, but because something has shifted in how you see it. Something has changed in the quality of your attention. You cannot unsee what you have seen. And what you do with that, the direction you choose to move in from here, that belongs entirely to you.